So I'm Andy. I'm one of the teacher trainers here at OMF, and in a short while I'll introduce our guest speakers for this evening, for this session. Barney's already introduced himself in the chat, and also Megan. But first of all, let's really arrive. Let's take a moment to really arrive through a short mindfulness practice, exploring anchors in the body, places where we feel most grounded. Um, and let's begin. Some of you have already done so, but just by making a deliberate shift in posture and perhaps allowing the eyes to close or lowering the gaze and a general sense of the whole body sitting here, holding the whole of the body in an awareness. Perhaps you're lying down or even standing up rather than sitting, just noticing how some sensations are more prominent than others, quite naturally, moment by moment. And when you're ready, beginning to move your attention down through the body and right down into the feet, and registering any sensations that show up here. Perhaps a little bit of contact as the feet meet the floor or they meet shoes or slippers. Maybe there's a temperature. Not so much thinking about sensations as just simply receiving them. And moving attention now from the feet to where the body meets the chair or perhaps the sofa or the bed if you're lying down. Perhaps stronger sensations here of contact and pressure. The solidity or softness of the surface underneath. The feel of clothing on skin, perhaps. Maybe sensing as if sensing what's here in this present moment for the very first time. And a choice point now to stay with one of these anchors, these places of groundedness in the lower body, or even with the whole of the lower body, or to choose the anchor of the breath where it's sensed best as it enters and as it leaves the body. Whatever your anchor, just this sensation, this breath. And now expanding again to the whole body as you sit or lie. And an invitation to notice, to take your attention to somewhere in the body where there's maybe pleasant sensations. Perhaps there's a little bit of warmth, or maybe it's cool air on skin, maybe some tingles. Maybe it's something that just feels okay. The connection with the chair or the feet on the floor again, a sense of connection. And resting attention here for a few moments. And these pleasant, these okay sensations. Receiving them, savoring a little. And beginning now to move fingers and toes a little and opening your eyes if they've been closed and bringing attention to the screen. A few years ago, I found myself alongside a colleague teaching MBCT-based courses in prison to men who had been experiencing mental health problems. And at the end of session one of the course, we thought we'd made a big mistake in suggesting to the men that they eat one meal mindfully over the course of the coming week. And there was a real kind of hullabaloo in the group. Men were throwing up their arms and kind of laughing at us and saying, we can't do that. You know, prison food is terrible. You've got no idea. So next week in session two, tentatively, we asked, how was it to eat a meal mindfully? And one man cleared his throat and he said, well, prison food is still pretty bad, but when paying attention mindfully, those first few sips of a cup of tea in the morning have become enjoyable. In fact, they've become quite special. So this man was appreciating, savouring a little his experience of sipping tea mindfully, experiencing almost like a small bubble of joy, a moment of okayness perhaps, and letting a little bit of light in amid very difficult circumstances. And so one doorway into activating positive emotions. And our guest speakers this evening, Barney, Dunn and Colletta, have been doing valuable and exciting work at Exeter University Centre for Mood Disorders in adapting mindfulness-based approaches to build positive emotions and enhance well-being. Megan and Barney will be offering a workshop for mindfulness teachers through OMF later this month, and I'll say a little bit more about that right at the end of the session. But I'd prepared some short profiles of Barney and Megan, and somewhat humbly they said, don't spend time introducing us because we'll do a little bit of that and say a little bit about ourselves, So I'm not going to do that. So over to you, Barney and Megan, and a really warm welcome on OMF. Welcome to you, both of you, on behalf of all of us.
Thank you very much, Andy, for the welcoming and the opening practice and those kind words. So we're going to start by introducing ourselves and then talk to you about our work trying to develop ways to build positive affect when it's hard to come by. So as Andy says, I'm Barney, and my kids call me the world's least mindful man, and also someone who's sometimes a little bit Eeyore-ish. So my kind of work careers followed my life, which is finding ways to connect to well-being and joy when it's hard to come by, and that isn't your natural ground to inhabit. And I'm going to talk to you today a bit about work we've been doing in depression and how that might translate into adapting mindfulness. And I'll let Megan introduce herself now.
Hey guys, so I'm Colletta. I'm one of Barney's colleagues in the Accept Clinic. And I came to mindfulness kind of, I guess, 25 years ago as a 20-year-old in college, searching for something, and lived at a monastery. And the journey has continued slowly along the way. But I really enjoy getting to work alongside Barney in the clinic and adapting this, mostly for folks with depression and other difficulties. So hopefully a little bit of my clinical piece will be meet Barney's research today and give you guys a taste of some of the work we do. And then hopefully we'll see you guys at the other side for the workshop and introduce more.
Absolutely. And whilst I've slightly tongue-in-cheek introduced myself as the least mindful man, I am completely sold on the benefits of mindfulness-based approaches to help people reconnect to well-being. I've been caretaker of a kind of mindfulness clinic and research centre at Exeter now for about 10 years since William Kuyken left. And we've heard story after story of clients really saying mindfulness helped, but it helped particularly in letting the light in. And that's very much the work we're going to be talking to you about today. So I'm going to go over to sharing my slides now. Megan, I'm assuming they're good to see?
Yep, they look great.
Okay. Today is the what and the why of how to build positive emotions with wellbeing, which we followed up with the how, which will be 2 half-day workshops delivered later in the month for OMF. What we're going to talk about today is what do we mean by positivity and why is it important to try and cultivate? Why is positivity sometimes hard to find, especially when we're depressed? What do we know about how well standard depression treatments can reconnect us to the positive? And what do we know about how well mindfulness might be an additional tool to reconnect us to the positive? And we're going to try and leave you with the tantalizing promise that there might be ways to enhance our existing mindfulness curricula to better reconnect clients to the positive, particularly in those clients who are like me, a bit naturally Eeyorish and struggle to find well-being at times. So I'm going to be delivering most of the scientific content. I'm periodically going to invite Megan in to share some kind of clinical insights and anecdotes as we go. First part of the talk is what do we mean by positivity and why does it matter? So beginning by what we mean by a positive emotion, it's a complex multi-component state. There's the feeling of, for this talk, I'm feeling slightly excited. There's the bodily response that goes with that. So around this talk, I can feel a lightness in my chest, but also some butterflies in my stomach that are indicative of excitement. I can feel an action tendency or a behavior to want to connect and speak to people. And I can feel a range of appraisals and thoughts running through my mind, which is, I feel really honoured and humbled to be allowed to present to this group. And I'm excited to get these ideas out to a new audience. So all of that together makes that positive emotion. And it can either be tied to a specific stimulus and be quite short-lived. So Andy gave a nice story about a morning cup of tea being quite special when you attend to it. That would be an example of a positive emotion. You can also have more of a background mood state. So it's that longer lasting feeling of, I feel good, I feel pleasant, I feel happy today. And that stays with you even as stimuli come in and go. And a lot of the clients I work with in my depression clinic, they say, I do want to feel less depressed, but more than that, I want to be able to re-experience well-being and pleasure in that way. It's the absence of the positive that's the thing they really want to work on. So positive emotion is one part of this broader construct called well-being, which means all things to all people. But my preferred definition of it is by American sociologist Corey Keyes. And he talks about the 3 planks of well-being, the pleasurable life, the meaningful life, and the social life. So the pleasurable life means you experience positive emotions and you're able to get joy and pleasure out of rewarding activities. The meaningful life is having a sense of purpose and meaning and things feeling that they're important and make sense to you in life. And the social life is feeling connected to other people, but also that you've got a valued social identity and a role to play in society. And I think if we can move most people towards a sense where they have some aspects of pleasure, some aspects of meaning, and some aspects of social connection and being socially valued, that promotes well-being, and a lot of mental health difficulties like depression fall away when that's all in place. So the technical term is sometimes used hedonic well-being for the pleasurable life, eudaimonic well-being for the meaningful life, but it means the same thing. So when we're thinking about positive emotion, often a lot of us think of the really big ticket items, you know, the massive excitement I feel jumping out of a plane, or that sense of overwhelming love when you're walking down the aisle on a wedding day. And those forms of high arousal, positive emotion, are good things and they're part of life we should try and cultivate. So excitement, energy, enthusiasm, and so on. But just as important as that are what we call the low arousal positive affect states. And this is where you feel kind of comfortable, serene, contented, happy in your own skin, and just a bit relaxed. We're increasingly convinced of the importance of trying to cultivate both these low and high arousal positive affect states in the depressed clients we work with, and that mindfulness can be one way to help clients engage with that. If you're like most people we work with, you will have a very exquisite and detailed vocabulary to describe your negative emotional world. You know, you'll be able to differentiate disgust from sadness, from anxiety. But most of us tend to be a little bit more impoverished in how we describe our positive experience. I feel good, but how would I exactly put a label on it? So part of the skill is being able to differentiate and recognize those different emotional states and what it takes to cultivate them. So yeah, I think it's a slightly false parable, but Eskimos have 1 million words for snow and only a few words for rain. The English have many words for negative emotions, but a more narrow vocabulary for positive emotions. So why should we care about cultivating positive mindfulness? Isn't that a kind of self-indulgent and pointless exercise? Well, we would argue not. First of all, we think positive emotion is in and of itself really important and valuable. So I'm slightly adapting a quote from Rabelais, who I probably pronounced wrong there, who said originally, without health, life is not life. It is only a state of languor and suffering, an image of death. I would adapt that to say, without well-being, life is not life. And life, do the thought experiment. Would you rather live a life where you had no emotion at all, no positive and no negative emotion, or would you rather live a rich, complex, ambivalent life where you experience the slings and arrows of fortune and you have both positive emotions and negative emotions? Most clients I work with say, actually, I want to feel again, and I'm happy to feel some negative to also be able to feel some positive. So positive emotion is important in and of itself, but it's also really important because of the evolutionary value that goes alongside it. So Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build theory talks about what positive emotions do to the way we engage with the world. First of all, it broadens our attention. It makes us think more novel things, and it makes us be a bit more creative. It also makes us more pro-social and go out to invest in our social world. So what it's really doing is facilitating us thinking ahead, developing our social network and our social capital and our resources so that when we face some challenges in life, we can be more resilient. So to go back to one of Jon Kabat-Zinn's favorite metaphors of mindfulness is about weaving your parachute every day. So it's there when you need to jump out of the plane. Experience positive emotions is also about weaving your parachute so that when you face some life difficulty, you can be resilient in the face of it. And we have some data that speaks to that question I'll present a bit later. The other kind of influential evolutionary account of why positive emotion matters is Paul Gilbert's 3 systems of mind model. And he basically talks about we're hardwired to have a threat system, which keeps us safe from punishments in the world, and that's what drives lots of our negative emotions. But just as importantly are 2 other systems. There's the drive system that motivates us to go out and find and gather resources. And that often goes with a lot of the high arousal positive emotions about, I'm excited to go out into the world to try and find stuff. I feel motivated to try and develop this capacity. And there's also a soothing system. How do we relax and calm and content ourselves? And that can be a way to repair and restore, but that's also the mental state when we're in that most makes us able to socially connect and bond with people. And that's particularly associated with low arousal positive emotions. So Paul would say high arousal emotions help us go out and get the things we want, resources in the world, and low arousal positive emotions help us connect and feel safe and soothing, and they're both important. So I guess the interim summary is positive emotion is important in its own right, but just as importantly, positive emotion builds resilience. And if we can help clients reconnect to positive emotion through mindfulness and other approaches, we may also be able to help them protect themselves from slipping back into states like depression or anxiety in the face of life challenges. So even if you're ambivalent about reconnecting to positive, think of it as a way to build resilience that allows you to navigate through the world. So isn't it just as simple as I want to experience positive emotions, so I should connect to positive things? Well, it is that simple, except depression and related mental health conditions trip us up in a variety of ways that make that well-being and positive affect hard to come by. So we're going to try and talk a bit about the phenomenology of pleasure experience in depression and how then we can go on to intervene with it a bit. So this is the symptom we refer to in depression is called anhedonia, and it's referred to as a loss of interest or pleasure in activities that you would previously have enjoyed. And it's one of the two core symptoms you need to get a diagnosis of depression. But the positivity deficits in depression are much broader than that. For me, it's captured quite well by this painting by Evelyn Williams, who's an artist with lived experience of depression. And this is called The Valley. And when you're depressed, navigating through the world, it feels like you're trudging, it's heavy, it's slow, it's dark. Even though you're surrounded by people, you feel very alone and yet at the same time trapped. And there feels an aimlessness, a purposelessness about it. Linking that back to what we know about how the reward systems in the brain function, we know there are three key reward systems, all of which are slightly altered by depression. There's the liking system that allows us to enjoy things when we gain rewards. There's the wanting system that builds our motivation to go out and seek rewards. And there's the learning system that when something goes well and is pleasurable, we store that in the brain so we're more likely to do it again in the future. And all three of those systems we now know are slightly altered in depression, so that positive emotion is harder to come by. And we also know that depression is characterized by broader deficits in well-being. So as well as not being able to experience pleasure, clients report a sense of losing meaning in life and losing a sense of connection in the world. One of my favorite videos that I give to a lot of clients we work with depression is the I Had a Black Dog video. It's a cartoon written by Matthew Livingston that talks about his own lived experience of depression, where he externalizes it as a black dog that comes in and sometimes makes his life difficult and challenging. And it's got some really beautiful quotes about the loss of pleasure and the loss of hope and the loss of social intimacy with people, and how that absence is just as important as a presence of heightened negative emotion. And another famous example you hear a lot about is Sylvia Plath's Bell Jar poem. And for me, this sums up anhedonia really beautifully. Wherever I sat, on the deck of a ship or at a street cafe in Paris or Bangkok, I would be sitting under the same vast bell jar, stewing in my own sour air. So it's almost like when we're depressed, even if we have lots of pleasurable things around us, accessing them and connecting with them is difficult and hard to come by. And actually that sense of I'm connected to this positive thing, but it's not giving me any pleasure, can make that an actively aversive situation. So how can we help clients to work through that? So your beautiful coffee in Paris tastes like beautiful coffee again, rather than feeling like stewing in my own sour air. This is a recent article that is called a meta-synthesis. And this is where they've got loads of people with lived experience of depression together, and also loads of people who've written about depression and pulled out what are the themes of the phenomenological experience of being really depressed. And a lot of the ones that came out were this absence of positivity. So feeling unable to experience positive emotions, feeling numb, empty, non-existent, and at its extreme form, as though they were dead, as though there was no energy left in the system. Feeling painfully incarcerated and trapped with that, and losing any sense of purpose and existential hope around it. And when we speak to a lot of our patients with depression, they speak that key to their definition of, I would know I was feeling better from depression if I was able to get some of that pleasure and meaning back. Megan, I wonder if you had anything to add based on some of the clients you've worked with about that phenomenological feel of anhedonia in depression.
Yeah, I think it's a very accurate description to the people I've worked with, and I think quite universal. And the thing that most people say is their best hope is that sense of getting to have a sense of contentment, is what we hear most these days. So, not even hitting the high positive arousal side of the mood circumplex, but really just if my coffee tasted like coffee again, if I was able to hold my husband's hand or have one of those small moments. So, I think that's the target we're often going for, is the granular.
Yeah, finding a way to connect to the glimmers of pleasure that everyday life offers us, but depression is very good at snuffing out. This is a metaphor we sometimes use with clients. Depression is like a candle snuffer in a church. There's a tiny little flicker of pleasure or well-being. Depression comes in and squashes it, and what the client remembers afterwards is the aftermath, the flickering smoke rather than the flame itself. And so a lot of the work we're trying to do is use therapy and also mindfulness techniques to get clients to notice that candle snuffer coming in. What are the psychological habits of mind that come in when pleasure starts to flow that eliminate it and even reverse it? Another kind of externalizing metaphor we sometimes like to use comes from the Harry Potter novels, this character of a Dementor that is drawn to people that have experienced trauma and likes to feed on their hope and positivity by sucking it out of them and leaving them as an empty shell. Depression, when it comes over us, it does that to us. It leaves us feeling hollowed out and empty. And how depression does that emptying and hollowing out is, first of all, it makes us avoid potentially positive situations. Second, when we're in those positive situations, it makes us direct our attention to the most negative or the least positive part of them. It also makes us think in a set of ways that diminish the positive experience. So I start to feel excited or hopeful about this talk, and maybe I have the thought, oh, you're being too big for your boots. People won't want to hear what you've got to say. That would be a classic dampening appraisal coming in and sucking the joy out of it. Depression can also make it harder for us to want to share and socially capitalize on our positive experience with others. It can mean that after the event, what we remember is the negative parts, not the positive parts of a situation. And it can also leave us with a sense of an impossibility of imagining a positive future. So depression's coming in, and it's meaning that everyday moments of positivity and well-being that are in all of our lives can't really be experienced or remembered afterwards. And we're interested in how we can use psychological and mindfulness techniques to notice those mechanisms coming in, take a step in the opposite direction, so those moments of pleasure and contentment start to last for a little bit longer. They're like glimmers of pleasure that extend and stretch out. And what we found is that quite a lot of the classic ways we've been trained to work, certainly as CBT therapists, but also sometimes in our mindfulness practice, inadvertently colluded with that tendency to focus on the negative and the difficult, and not to lean in and actively engage and actively react to the positive. So we'll talk a bit about how to do that. Megan, are you seeing those kind of pleasure blocking mechanisms in the clients you're working with at the moment?
Yeah, these are almost universal. I would say the sense that if someone has experienced either a single episode or long-term depression, they have difficulty accessing the good. And when something, even a little glimmer comes in, there's a dampening appraisal or a sense of aversion or even an avoidance of going back to that in the room. So this is what we experience almost every day, and probably is universal to the folks who've had difficulty that are sharing the space with us tonight.
So I guess as mindfulness teachers, if there are those of you in the room, you'll be aware that the core parts of the mindfulness program are about noticing negative mood leading to unhelpful patterns of reactivity that exacerbate that negative mood. I guess our claim here is that there are also unhelpful patterns of reactivity when positive emotion gets switched on that snuff it out. And you can use mindfulness techniques in the same way to notice those patterns of reactivity, not go with them, and instead actively engage with the positive in a different way. So to reconnect to it. So when you're depressed, not only is positivity hard to find, positive situations can be actively aversive. It can feel scary and unnatural to feel positive when you haven't felt it for a while. It can feel a bit disgusting, a bit yucky. It can cultivate a feeling of distrust and suspiciousness. And so what we're increasingly thinking of is depression's a little bit like an anxiety condition, but where what people are scared of is starting to feel good. And when they start to feel good, they have a whole series of patterns of mind that help them avoid that positivity and step away from it. And we're interested in how we can use psychological therapies and mindfulness techniques to notice those patterns of avoidant reactivity and instead lean in and engage with the stimulus. So that's very much talking about the pleasurable aspects of life. But what depression also does when it comes over us is it can make us lose our way about our sense of what's important to us, what matters to us, and what gives life meaning. It can be a bit like I live in Devon, which is a beautiful part of the world, but has quite stormy weather where rain comes in. And I can be out on a walk and I can know exactly where I'm going. But when the weather comes in, I really need my map and compass to keep me on the path so I can get safely home. And depression's a bit like the weather coming in and it being hard to read our map and compass so that we continue living a values consistent life, even if it's no longer pleasurable. So how can we use mindfulness to help us get there? So all in all, we think reconnecting to positive emotion in depression, it sounds simple, but it's a deceptively difficult task. You've got to learn to let the light in, but it's just like when you're trying to light a small fire when you've been camping in the rain and you get a tiny ember, you can't suddenly blow loads of oxygen on it because it just puts it out and it blows everywhere. You've got to learn to gently cultivate it in a way that is manageable and tolerable. You've got to notice and help the client act opposite to patterns of mind that as the flames start to burn a bit, will be wanting to put them out. And we've got to help clients rediscover their inner compass about what matters to them so they can live a life that's consistent with that. So it sounds simple, but it's quite difficult to do skillfully. And I hope you're starting to realize it's subtly different to what we might do around some aspects of mindfulness with the negative, because we're actively encouraging a particular form of engagement and connection to stimulus rather than a non-judgmental sitting back observing. We're also actively leaning in, but in a different way. So interim summary there, a core component of depression is reduced positive emotion experience and well-being. And it's not as simple as saying to a depressed person, why don't you just get back to doing the stuff you used to love? Because all those habits of mind will make that stuff aversive and maybe actively unpleasant. So we need to give people skills that reconnect them to positive elements of life, whilst recognizing it can be difficult and challenging to do, both when you're depressed, but also when life throws us very real challenges. So that sense of what we would call positive realism rather than positive idealism. How can we go, we know life's difficult and challenging and mood is sometimes low, and at the same time, there are small moments of well-being and pleasure that can be had, and we can give you skills to stretch those out. And getting that balance right is the way that you can start to reconnect people. Megan, I don't know if you've got anything to add about that challenge of not being too Pollyanna-ish or too overly positive with clients where well-being's hard to find.
Yeah, I think it's a delicate balance, and probably everyone listening can appreciate that if you were in this situation, you wouldn't want to be pushed hard into the positive, but actually it's a graded approach and going at someone's pace and recognizing really their window of tolerance to take in the good where it's often felt quite aversive.
So I'm going to skip over this next bit at speed so we have enough time to talk about the mindfulness piece that's really key to this presentation. We've done a whole series of work that's looked at how well do existing psychological therapies repair positive emotions as opposed to negative emotions. And the very clear headline we found across things like cognitive behavioral activation and behavioral activation, which are two of our core therapies for depression, is they're actually very good at bringing down negative emotions. So at the end of treatment, people are back to general population typical levels. Whereas they're less good at reconnecting people to positive. They do increase positive emotions, but people after a successful treatment are often left still a long way below general population typical values. And saying things like, well, I'm not depressed anymore, Barney, but I'm still not really enjoying things, and I'm not sure why I want to get out of bed. And that's led us to a program of work to think, well, how could we be more skillfully reconnecting people to the positive as well as the negative. So we've shown that in secondary analyses of antidepressant medication, secondary analyses of cognitive behavioral therapy, secondary analyses of behavioral activation approaches, and also secondary analyses of routine therapy delivered in UK NHS talking therapy services. It's the same pattern. Positive affect does slightly increase, well-being slightly increases, but people are still a long way below general population typical levels and what we call languishing at the end of after otherwise successful therapy. So there's room for improvement. Might mindfulness be one way to connect people back to the positive? So I'm sure you're all familiar with programs like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression, a structured 8-week course that combines psychoeducation and mindfulness techniques to help individuals who are vulnerable to depressive relapse stay well for the long term. And the kind of core kind of thinking behind mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression is individuals who've had a history of depression, when they experience negative mood, they have a vulnerability for depressogenic thinking to get reactivated. And that depressogenic thinking tends to be characterized by avoidance, rumination, so that's repetitive negative thoughts about the causes, meanings, and consequences of depression, and also self-criticism. And they tend to do that in a kind of evaluative mode, going, I want to be feeling better, I'm not feeling better, what's wrong with me? How can I get closer towards my goal? So what that pattern of reactivity does is it sustains negative emotions with small, subtle bits of depression that are often around in between episodes, turning back again into a full-blown depressive episode. So what mindfulness gives us in the standard mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression program is a different way to respond to that negative affect that doesn't reactivate the depression. Deliberately bringing kind, non-judgmental awareness to thoughts, feelings, and sensations, allowing thoughts to naturally pass as events in the mind, not as facts, and choosing to take wise action instead. So temporary negative mood doesn't turn into full-blown depression, and a full-blown episode doesn't return. So that's very much been the explicit rationale underpinning treatments like mindfulness. It's about stopping negative reactivity. But we were increasingly interested in a number of clients who said, it's also let the light back in. I've also found a way to reconnect to pleasure and joy. So we started to begin to look at, well, is that happening and how might it be happening? So if you look in detail at the curriculum in programs like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for life, positivity is definitely embodied by the teacher leading the course. They're warm, welcome, kind, curious, and open. Teaching cultivates an ability to notice the present moment with a gentle, interested, and kind stance. The course supports the intention to practice kindness and compassion and difficulty, inclining them towards these more positive qualities. And this positivity elements are somewhat explicit in one piece we do in the mindfulness program called the Pleasant Events Calendar, which is supporting participants to notice what everyday activities in life nourish them. However, it's relatively implicit and understated in the current mindfulness curriculum. Nevertheless, might it still begin to open the light up again and reconnect people to positive emotions? And by doing so, might it reduce people's risk for depression coming back? So the first person who looked at this was Nicole Geschwind in Holland, who did what's called an experience sampling study. She got people to report their emotional experience multiple times every day for a week before a mindfulness course and after a mindfulness course, compared to individuals who are in a wait list and got no kind of treatment. And what she found is those individuals who underwent mindfulness reported experiencing more general levels of background positive mood, rating everyday activities as more pleasant, and when they engage with the pleasant activity, showing a greater uplift of positive emotions. So it was a small but clinically meaningful effect. This mindfulness curriculum, designed to stop negative reactivity to negative mood, was also letting the light in a bit. So we went on to try and replicate that in another big trial looking at mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for individuals with depression. So this is the PREVENT trial, where folks with a history of depression who were well on antidepressant medication were invited to do mindfulness instead and taper from their meds or continue with their medication. And in a secondary analysis, we looked at something called the dispositional positive emotion scale, which is basically how much joy, contentment, and awe were individuals able to experience in everyday life. And what we found is those allocated to the mindfulness group showed a small but clinically meaningful and significant improvement in that positive emotion experience compared to those who just continued with their antidepressant medication. So there's something about mindfulness that is letting in the positive. We've also then done some work to go, well, what is it about mindfulness? Because mindfulness is a very complicated practice with many elements. One of the things we found is it's particularly the capacity to sensorily observe what's happening outside of your body. So there's external senses, feeling the sun on your face, smelling your coffee, tasting a delicious food, hearing the ticking of a clock. It's inhabiting that kind of sensory world more than inhabiting your internal body. The capacity to do that is increased by mindfulness, and the extent to which mindfulness increases that capacity then in turn predicts how much more positive emotion you're going to experience. So I really like Norm Farb and Zindel Segal's recent writings about what they call sensory foraging, which I think is basically talking about that, using mindfulness as a way to connect with the rich multi-sensory world around us as one gateway back to the positive. So mindfulness does indeed improve positive emotions. Might it, by doing so, might that be one key mechanism by which it keeps us well and stops us relapsing back into depression? And we've just had a paper accepted that indeed supports that claim. So this is another secondary analysis of the PREVENT trial, where we're seeing, does the extent of positive emotion people have when they first enter the trial predict how long they stay well from depression? And that's exactly what we found. Was the more positivity people were experiencing, the more they stayed well for the long term and didn't relapse into depression. And that was over and above depression symptoms. And maybe more interestingly than that, the extent to which mindfulness practice then was able to increase people's positivity accounted for the protective effects mindfulness gave people about relapsing from depression. So those individuals who, when they went through the mindfulness program, showed the biggest increase in positive emotion were the ones who were least likely to relapse over the following 2 years. And again, that was over and above all of the changes in negative emotions and depression symptoms that we typically think are the key stuff that mindfulness works on. Maybe it's about working on that capacity to reconnect to the positive as much as reduce that connection to the negative. So where have we got to? MBCT implicitly targets positivity. It does lead to meaningful improvements in that, partly through this capacity to engage with external senses, and that capacity in turn protects people from relapsing. But these effects are quite small, and might we be able to enhance it? So this is where the one-day workshop that follows this introductory talk will go, is talking about attempts we've made to develop a therapy called augmented depression therapy to work on those mechanisms of mind that make pleasure and well-being hard to come by, and to reconnect to well-being and pleasure by doing so. So you might begin by saying, well, why wouldn't you just go with another mindfulness curriculum like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for life? This is a treatment that's been specifically designed to cultivate well-being in the general population. Well, what mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for life wasn't designed to do was to work with all of these pleasure blocking mechanisms that make pleasure particularly difficult to find when you're depressed. And it's also a very busy and challenging curriculum to do. So when you are very depressed, it's a hard thing to lean into. So we thought, well, let's see where else we can go. So the treatment we've come up with is called augmented depression therapy. In short, it involves getting clients to identify what's important to them in life, activate them towards achieving goals consistent with those things that are important to them. And while they do that, we fully expect that depression is going to try and trip them up in two ways. When life throws them a few challenging curveballs, it's going to make it harder for them to be resilient in the face of those. But also when life throws them a few opportunities, depression is going to make it hard to run with those and experience pleasure and positive emotions. So ADEPT trains people to notice, how does their depressed mind trip them up when they're experiencing those challenges and opportunities? And how can they learn to take a step in the opposite direction to be able to be resilient and to savor those positive moments? So in preliminary work, it looks like this is a promising approach. We've done what's called a small pilot randomized control trial, and we've seen, is it any better than our current gold standard psychological therapy for depression, cognitive behavioral therapy, at enhancing anhedonia and well-being? And the headline answer is probably yes, but we now need a bigger trial to confirm that. So CBT did make people less anhedonic, but ADEPT had a bigger improvement in anhedonia than CBT. And CBT did enhance clients' well-being, but ADEPT had a bigger impact on clients' well-being. So they were closer to general population averages for both anhedonia and well-being at the end of treatment. And that also translated into potentially better long-term outcomes for depression. People in the ADEPT arm were more likely to remit from depression when treated with ADEPT than CBT. So something like 80% of clients we treated remitted in ADEPT versus about 60% in CBT. And of those who remitted, more of them were likely to stay well for the long term in ADEPT rather than CBT. So you can see that focus on the positivity predicting long-term relapse prevention mirrors our mindfulness secondary analysis findings. So the interim summary is ADEPT shows potential to enhance capacity to build positivity in depressed clients, but we need another trial to do it. So the overall summary, and I guess the teaser and the taster for the workshop that might follow, is positivity is important in its own right and helps build resilience. Deficits in positivity are core to depression and related clinical conditions. Our current treatments are only partially effective at reconnecting to the positive, but if we can make them better at doing so, that will be valuable in its own right, but also keep people well for the long term. And one way forward is to integrate elements from emerging positive clinical psychology approaches like ADEPT into mindfulness curricula, so they're powered up in their capacity to experience the positive. And that is what our subsequent workshop will be presenting on. How do we do that? What are the changes and tweaks we make to mindfulness programs to really allow that light to come flooding back in? So I'm going to stop there and open the floor up to questions.
Thanks very much, Barney, for a really informative, vivid and informative, hugely informative, actually, presentation. I'm sure we'll all agree. There's some questions starting to come into the chat now, and a few people have asked about a recording being available, and it will be available on social media. Sorry, it will be available in a few days. Keep an eye on social media. One question that's come up there is presumably a sustained mindfulness practice is key to keeping well after completing an MBCT program. I can see Megan nodding vigorously there. I wondered if you want to come in and respond, Megan.
I'd be happy to. I didn't see who that came from, but a really good question and absolutely recommended, whether it's a formal practice or informally woven into your days. Sustaining it is going to help with depression relapse for sure. And I think it is a challenge. So also permitting yourself to start again whenever it falls away. All the mindfulness teachers here nodding in agreement that this will happen over time.
And the one thing we'd add from the positivity lens is there might be a particularly important place for informal everyday mindfulness here, rather than formal lengthy practices that often require discipline and can have effort. Just bringing that attitudinal quality to the everyday moments and opportunities life gives you is the particular thing we really help clients to keep practicing.
Thanks, Megan and Barney. There's another question here just around about, just wondering how you would work with the physical aspects of depression, which can mean that you may feel too exhausted to connect with the positive.
Well, so that is one of the changes we'll be talking about in the workshop, about what do you use as your anchor in meditation exercises? Because when I'm depressed, it feels like I've constantly got the flu. My body is an aversive, difficult, uncomfortable place. And when I come to it, it's not safe, it's not neutral, it lowers my mood. So what we do is we work very much on the external sensory anchors first. We allow the positive affect to have got properly switched on before coming back to the body only at the end of that process. So I might have done 5 minutes of external sensory exploration before I then go, and now you've allowed that positive affect to flow. What do you notice in your body that might be different? Oh, I feel a tiny bit lighter. I feel my chest is open a bit more. But if you go straight to the body when people are really depressed, it isn't a way to potentiate the positive, is our experience.
Thanks, Barney and Megan again. Just a reminder, if you could, to put your questions in the chat, and we'll harvest them via the chat in the coming minutes. Jamie asked, what format is the therapy offered in? Is it one-to-one or group? And is it of a fixed length? Is it a protocol? Is it a tight protocol of some kind?
So augmented depression therapy, as we've configured it at the moment, is a 15 individual session acute treatment with 5 booster sessions over the next year. And we're trialing that for what we're more stuck treatment-resistant depression that hasn't got better from frontline treatments. The adaptations we're bringing into mindfulness, actually, what we're trying to do is develop a 4-session follow-on curriculum that people might be able to use as a taster to begin to re-experience the positive in what we're calling the kind of resilience and recovery phase for people with complex mental health who've moved towards well-being but are still languishing a bit.
Thank you. And someone else asks here, Jan asks, where the improvements noted in your study, was it by way of patient-filled questionnaires? How did you gather the data from the participants?
Well, what we used is mixed methods. So most of it is a mixture of patients reporting on questionnaires, therapists conducting interviews, therapists, clinical interviews, do you meet diagnostic criteria for depression? But actually the stuff I'm most sold by is we do qualitative interviews with people. We talk to them for an hour. What did you make of therapy? What changes came about? And it's the stories that come out of that really convinced me as a clinician that we're onto something, where you get that triangulation between questionnaires are moving in the right way, clinical interviews are moving in the right way, but critically clients say this has been transformative in some ways. That's when we're sold on things.
Yeah, lovely, Barney. I see lots of nods and kind of warm smiles there when you were talking about that particular way of collating data in those conversations with people. Ruth asks, is it more difficult to convince someone with depression that thoughts are mental events?
Well, it is really difficult when you've been depressed for a while. It becomes you. So one of the challenges and goals in Adept is we're trying to get people to diffuse and decenter from their thoughts, and we do that with the classic, mindfulness exercises and ACT cognitive diffusion techniques. But what you'll have noticed is I use a lot of metaphor, and we use a lot of externalizing metaphors. When the black dog's barking in your ear, when the dementor is sucking the pleasure out of you, when that old depressed record player is talking again. And we're constantly using a form of words that get people to separate themselves from this depression thing that comes over them. And often when you use that language in a metaphorical sense for a few weeks, then the decentering naturally starts to happen. They'll go, oh yeah, there's that depressed voice telling me again. Oh yeah, there's that black dog barking again. And when you've got people to that point, then you can step into more formal decentering and diffusion practices. But you also have to validate with clients, look, you've lived with this for 20 or 30 years. You've tried 5 or 6 therapies. You haven't got better before. And this feels a habit. We're trying to get you to learn a new habit. So let's expect it to be slow and take quite a lot of practice, including learning to step away from your thoughts.
Thank you. Kate asks, how have you looked at copying the approach for bipolar conditions? Are prolonged highs approached in a similar way to prolonged lows?
Well, I'll come back to Megan to give a clinical take on this because she's also involved in quite a lot of bipolar work we're doing. But in our early trials, we set bipolar disorder as an exclusion criteria because we were worried about an unhelpful ascent into mania by activating people and getting them too buzzy. What we found, though, is that people inevitably end up in trials and then you discover those features later. And actually, that capacity to connect to low arousal positive affect, that calm, contentment, serenity, it's actually profoundly helpful for those clients. So we haven't trialed it yet. My strong sense you shouldn't do it has now weakened to, I think it might work, but we need to investigate it further. What do you think, Megan?
I would definitely add, having trialed a few therapies that are similar to ADEPT for bipolar disorder, the behavioral activation piece works within limits. So it does really help with that piece of connecting to what matters, to getting back to valued living, but then, with a careful titration around the high end and going for a moderate range as opposed to continuously pushing for high arousal positive states. So that needs to be very carefully managed, but a lot of the tools and techniques are useful in both bipolar and depression.
The metaphor we quite often use is it's like driving a car. So depression is often your car's stuck going 7 miles an hour on the motorway, and how can we gently accelerate you up to 50? Sometimes with bipolar disorder, the car's ticking along at 50, but it's now veering towards 70, 80, 90. And how can we get you to gently dab your foot on the brake? And low arousal positive affect is surprisingly effective at, let's calm you down now. Let's chill you out. It's an interesting aside that I remember in the early days of mindfulness, people got very cross when people said, well, maybe it's just relaxation. I do think part of mindfulness is relaxation. I don't think it's its only mechanism of action, but that low arousal, calm, serenity that you get from controlled breathing, I think is a genuine active ingredient of the treatment.
Thank you, Barney. I love just those little metaphors and analogies that you're using to support us in understanding your work, and as well. We've probably got time for one more very brief answer to a question. And just to say that Barney and Megan have said that they will respond to other questions. Perhaps we can add those on at the end of the podcast, the questions that we've not been able to get to tonight. Paul asks, I'm interested in this being scared of feeling good. Can you say a bit more about the causes? If you can pin them down, like feelings of guilt come to mind or others. Is there a brief answer to that question, or might it be best to add that on at the end of the podcast?
Well, it's the key question. How can the positive become aversive? And I think it's when you engage with something that's positive and all of these mechanisms play out, like you dampen it, you attend to it differently, you remember it differently. Actually, actively, what that does is it not only reduces positive emotions, it switches back on negative emotions. I can remember working with a lady in her 60s who desperately wanted a grandchild, was holding her grandchild for the first time. Dampening came in that turned that into a flat experience. And then a whole set of secondary appraisals came in about, why am I enjoying this? What's wrong with me? I must be toxic. I'm going to damage this child. So this longed for positive experience became actively aversive. And then she wanted to avoid her grandchild for a few months afterwards because she just thought, I'm damaging the child and I'm damaged. So when you have enough of those kind of experiences, the positive actually has become aversive, and it's only when you strip away those mechanisms that you can get back to enjoying it again. So I think it's based on learning history of these mechanisms making the positive unpleasant.
Thank you, Barney. So just again, a huge thanks to both of you for the clear presentation that you've offered tonight, and your patience and elaborations in the questions too. And just for all the mindfulness teachers, really just wanted to flag up the workshop again. Let me just bring this to the forefront of my screen, and you can also see more information in the chat there about how to sign up. So upcoming workshop, Letting the Light In, on the 17th and the 24th from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. each day. And also a more detail on what's covered there, an understanding of the positive valence system, why it's important, and what we understand about how mindfulness can address it, and developing enhanced skills and delivering mindfulness practices that build positivity, including the barriers, and learning also about emerging techniques in other CBT therapies, or CBT therapy schools that target positivity that might be incorporated in mindfulness groups and in one-to-one therapy there. So yeah, and a huge thanks to all of you for coming along, for your interest and for your support of OMF, and again to Barney and Megan, and also just hoping to see some of you as mindfulness teachers there on the 2.5-day workshops. And as is custom, well, just before we do, actually, just an invitation also, maybe this evening or today, depending on where you're at, to do something that's a little bit nourishing or something that's okay, that you can bring into your day after you know, the topic that we've covered, and as you go forth into what the rest of the day offers. So, and in true OMF fashion, please feel free to unmute and say bye in your own language, and see you all again, either at our practice sessions or one of our guest speaker events. Go well, everyone, really go well.
And a massive thank you for me and Megan for giving up an hour of your time to listen, and thanks to the OMF for the great opportunity to present to you all.
Thank you all. This is a real pleasure.
Please do
so much.
unmute and say
Wonderful.
bye.
Bye.